Imagine a place hidden deep in the lush hills of Natchez, Mississippi, a place where history's shadows have long lingered, yet few dare to speak its name. This is the Devil's Punch Bowl, a naturally enclosed depression that, over 150 years ago, became the site of unimaginable suffering. Here, thousands of Black Americans, newly freed from the chains of slavery, were imprisoned during the American Civil War. They had fought for the Union, risking their lives for the promise of freedom. Yet upon reaching this so-called sanctuary, they were met with cruelty, deprivation, and despair. The very earth seemed to mourn the souls trapped within its depths. Women and children were confined behind high walls, forced to endure grueling labor, scant rations, and harsh weather. Disease spread unchecked, and mortality ran rampant. Families were torn apart, and the basic dignity every human deserves was systematically denied. These were people who had already endured a lifetime of oppression, only to face betrayal at the hands of the nation they had helped to preserve. What makes the Devil's Punch Bowl even more haunting is how easily it was erased from history. While textbooks celebrate victories and battles, the stories of those who suffered in silence were buried alongside them. Yet, the echoes of their pain remain in the soil, in the stories passed down through generations, and in the occasional skeletal remains unearthed by the Mississippi River. The Punch Bowl stands as a stark reminder that freedom is not merely a declaration, it is a struggle, often fraught with obstacles, betrayal, and sorrow. Today, as we explore this forgotten chapter, it is crucial to remember the resilience and courage of those who endured. They were not simply victims. They were pioneers of hope, forging paths toward liberation and justice against overwhelming odds. Their lives, their stories, and their sacrifices demand recognition. By uncovering the truths of places like the Devil's Punch Bowl, we honor their memory and confront the realities of a past that too often remains hidden. If you want to journey deeper into history, to uncover stories that challenge what we think we know, then make sure to hit that like button, share this video, and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can shed light on the untold stories of the past, ensuring they are never forgotten and continue to inspire the present and future. Let us step into the shadows of Natchez, Mississippi, and uncover the history of the Devil's Punch Bowl, a story of survival, resilience, and the enduring fight for freedom. As the sun rose over the dense, green hills of Natchez, Mississippi, the Devil's Punch Bowl revealed itself not as a place of beauty, but as a crucible of human suffering, where the echoes of pain seemed to linger in the humid morning air. Within its deep, enclosing walls, thousands of freed Black Americans found themselves trapped in conditions that tested the limits of endurance and spirit. These were men, women, and children who had dared to dream of freedom, who had risked their lives on battlefields far from home, fighting alongside Union soldiers with the hope that their courage would secure a life of dignity. Yet they were met with an entirely different reality, one that stripped away every hope of comfort and safety. The prisoners were subjected to labor so grueling that even the strongest among them found their bodies bending under the weight of exhaustion. They were forced to dig, to build, to toil under the scorching Mississippi sun, often without proper tools, and with minimal nourishment to sustain them. Their meals, when provided, were sparse and nutritionally inadequate, leaving them weakened and vulnerable. Malnutrition became a quiet oppressor, sapping energy and dampening the spark of resilience that flickered in every person's eyes. Hunger gnawed at children who had never before known the bitterness of deprivation, and at parents who could do nothing but watch their loved ones struggle against an invisible tide of starvation and despair. Disease spread like wildfire through the camp, thriving in the cramped and unsanitary conditions that offered no relief from the relentless suffering. Smallpox, dysentery, and fevers ravaged the population, claiming lives without discrimination, and leaving those who survived with weakened bodies and shattered spirits. Medical care was either minimal or non-existent, and the sick often languished without attention, their suffering observed with cold detachment by those enforcing the cruel order of the camp. The air was heavy with the stench of illness and decay. And yet, even in this atmosphere of despair, the prisoners clung to the fragments of their humanity, holding on to one another for support, whispering stories of freedom that seemed both impossibly distant and desperately necessary to survive each day. Families were torn apart under the weight of circumstance, with fathers and mothers separated from children, siblings divided, and loved ones lost to the relentless march of mortality. The bonds that had once provided comfort and hope became strained under the constant threat of death and the harsh demands of labor. Yet within these walls of suffering, moments of resilience emerged. Quiet acts of care, a parent shielding a child from the sun, neighbors sharing scraps of food. Whispered words of encouragement formed threads of humanity that refused to be extinguished. These small gestures became lifelines, sustaining spirits that the oppressive conditions sought to crush. The mortality rate within the Devil's Punch Bowl was staggering, surpassing even the harsh realities of plantations where families had endured years of servitude. Here, the promise of freedom became a cruel illusion, a bitter contrast to the hope that had carried so many to this place. The very landscape, which might have seemed nurturing and fertile, held a darker truth beneath its surface. The ground was a silent witness to the countless lives lost, and the cycles of grief and endurance etched into the soil by the relentless presence of death. Graves were hastily dug, often shallow and incomplete, the decomposing bodies adding to the pervasive despair, while the living were left to labor amidst the reminders of mortality, their own fates uncertain and precarious. Despite this, the prisoners displayed extraordinary resilience, drawing upon the strength of memory, culture, and shared experience to sustain themselves. They remembered songs and stories from their past, using these as shields against despair and as affirmations of identity and hope. Music and whispered tales of endurance became forms of subtle rebellion, asserting the presence of life and spirit even in the midst conditions designed to erase both. Each day that they survived, each act of mutual care, became a testament to human resilience, a quiet but unyielding defiance against the forces arrayed to break them. The experiences within the Devil's Punch Bowl highlight a painful paradox. Even as freedom was promised by the Emancipation Proclamation, the reality for those who sought it was often far grimmer than they could have imagined. The physical and psychological toll of forced labor, malnutrition, disease, and high mortality rates underscored the gap between the ideal of liberty and the lived experience of those newly freed. These individuals had fought valiantly for a cause that was larger than themselves. Yet their sacrifice was met with conditions so severe that survival itself became an act of courage, a daily assertion of dignity against overwhelming adversity. As we reflect on this chapter of history, the story of the Devil's Punch Bowl serves not only as a record of suffering, but as a testament to resilience and the enduring human spirit. It challenges us to recognize the full scope of the struggles faced by those who came before, to honor their endurance, and to acknowledge the historical realities that too often remain hidden. By understanding the depth of their suffering, we gain insight into the magnitude of their courage and the cost of freedom in a world where promises and reality were cruelly misaligned, reminding us that the fight for dignity and justice is both timeless and deeply human. Even as the Devil's Punch Bowl bore witness to unimaginable suffering, the world outside remained largely unaware of the horrors unfolding within its natural walls, a silence that would stretch for generations. History, as it is often told, favors triumphs and celebrated victories, moments that fit neatly into narratives of progress and national pride. Yet the shadows of human suffering, especially when intertwined with issues of race and oppression, are too easily buried beneath the weight of selective memory. The atrocities experienced by freed Black Americans imprisoned within the Punch Bowl were systematically omitted from the mainstream telling of American history. And in that omission, a crucial piece of the nation's past was lost, leaving the survivors and their descendants to wrestle with invisible wounds that the textbooks never acknowledged. For those confined within the Devil's Punch Bowl, each day was a struggle for survival. But for the broader society, the knowledge of their plight was largely absent. Newspapers of the time occasionally documented events related to the Civil War, yet the specific suffering of freed slaves in camps like Natchez was relegated to the margins, mentioned only in passing. The focus of public attention centered on the great battles, the political maneuvers, and the images of leadership that defined the North and South, leaving the lived realities of thousands of Black Americans unexamined and unrecorded. The system of historical storytelling itself contributed to the erasure, emphasizing narratives that reinforced national unity and heroic idealism while glossing over the inconvenient truths of racial violence, systemic cruelty, and human endurance under oppression. This omission had consequences far beyond mere historical record. By excluding the Devil's Punch Bowl and similar sites from collective memory, generations of Americans grew up unaware of the depth of suffering that underpinned the struggle for freedom. The idea that emancipation automatically translated into liberation was reinforced, masking the brutal reality that for many, the end of slavery did not mean safety, equality, or even basic survival. Freed Black Americans who had endured unimaginable hardship on plantations, who had fought bravely in the Union Army, and who had risked their lives for the promise of liberty found that the nation's recognition of their struggle was fleeting and incomplete, overshadowed by narratives that celebrated victories while ignoring the cost paid by the marginalized. The erasure of these experiences from public consciousness contributed to the perpetuation of systemic inequities, as the lessons of empathy, justice, and accountability remained untaught and unacknowledged. Even within academic circles, the story of the Devil's Punch Bowl was often overlooked, treated as a footnote to broader analysis of the Civil War or Reconstruction, a grim anecdote rather than a defining episode in the American narrative. Scholars who uncovered evidence of the camp through archaeological findings, historical records, and survivor accounts faced the challenge of integrating this painful history into a society still reluctant to confront its full implications. The mass graves discovered, the skeletal remains unearthed, and the testimonies of those who had survived or remembered the suffering could not easily be reconciled with the sanitized images of freedom and progress that dominated history books and public consciousness. In a sense, the very act of remembering the Punch Bowl became an act of resistance, a demand to confront the truths that had been hidden and to honor the lives of those who had been subjected to such extreme cruelty. The erasure of the Devil's Punch Bowl from mainstream history also illustrates the broader patterns of neglect that shaped the experience of Black Americans during and after the Civil War. While the nation celebrated the Emancipation Proclamation as a landmark achievement, the realities faced by those newly freed, imprisonment, exploitation, hunger, and disease, were largely invisible to the dominant culture. The omission of these stories from public narratives allowed myths of seamless liberation to flourish, masking the ongoing struggles that would define the Reconstruction era and beyond. For the descendants of those imprisoned at Natchez, the silence of history became a burden, a reminder that their ancestors' suffering had been denied acknowledgement even as the nation celebrated its ideals of liberty and justice. Yet, even in the face of this erasure, the legacy of the Devil's Punch Bowl endures through memory, scholarship, and the courage of those committed to telling the untold stories. Every excavation, every historical investigation, and every narrative that illuminates the suffering and resilience of the freed Black Americans imprisoned there serves to correct the omissions of the past. By bringing these stories into public awareness, we confront the full spectrum of the nation's history, recognizing that the journey toward freedom and equality was neither simple nor immediate, and that the cost of liberty was borne disproportionately by those whose voices were systematically silenced. The Devil's Punch Bowl, once hidden from history, now stands as a testament to resilience, a reminder that the truth, however uncomfortable, must be acknowledged, remembered, and learned from in order for society to genuinely honor the sacrifices of those who came before, and to build a more just and informed future. The story of the Devil's Punch Bowl cannot be fully understood without stepping back to witness the larger forces that tore the nation apart. Forces that shaped the lives of those who would ultimately suffer within its walls. In the mid-19th century, America was a land of stark contrasts, a country divided not only by geography but by ideology, economy, and the very principles that defined human worth. In the North, cities were rising, smokestacks pierced the sky, and industry was reshaping the landscape, drawing people into bustling centers of commerce and innovation, where the rhythms of labor were dictated by machinery and markets rather than the seasons of the earth. Here, many voices, increasingly outspoken and morally conscious, began to challenge the institution of slavery, arguing that it was not only morally indefensible, but also economically inefficient in a world moving toward wage labor and mechanized production. The industrialized North envisioned a future built on free labor, mobility, and opportunity, where human beings were no longer commodities to be bought, sold, or coursed, and this vision would inevitably clash with the entrenched ways of the South. The South, in contrast, remained an agrarian world, a landscape of vast plantations stretching across fertile valleys and rolling hills, where cotton, tobacco, and sugar defined the rhythm of life and the structure of society. Labor here was not a choice but a condition imposed through slavery, a system that had been woven into the very identity of the region, shaping its culture, its economy, and its sense of honor. Wealth, status, and influence were measured by land and the number of enslaved people one controlled. And the thought of dismantling this system threatened not only economic stability, but the social fabric that had sustained generations. Southern leaders, plantation owners, and communities viewed the growing anti-slavery sentiment from the North as an existential threat, an attempt to upend a world that had been meticulously constructed and justified for centuries. And in their minds, resistance was not merely a matter of preference but a necessity for survival. Tensions between these two worlds simmered for decades, flaring over issues that intertwined deeply with questions of power, autonomy, and identity. Debates over states' rights became battlegrounds for larger moral questions, as Southern states insisted on the authority to maintain and expand slavery without interference, while Northern politicians, activists, and communities increasingly challenged the legitimacy of such practices, arguing that slavery undermined the very principles of liberty and human dignity that the nation claimed to uphold. Economic differences further heightened the divide, as the North's industrial economy demanded different policies, infrastructure, and labor systems, while the South's agricultural dependence on enslaved labor created incentives to preserve the old order at almost any cost. These regional divergences were not abstract, they manifested in legislation, public discourse, and ultimately, in the willingness of entire communities to prepare for war to protect their vision of life, prosperity, and autonomy. The clash was both inevitable and profoundly human, rooted in competing worldviews and the fear, pride, and hope of entire populations. Northern leaders, including President Abraham Lincoln, navigated a landscape fraught with moral imperatives and political realities, striving to hold the Union together while confronting the inhumanity of slavery, aware that every decision carried consequences for soldiers on the battlefield and civilians alike. Meanwhile, Southern leaders, from Jefferson Davis to Robert E. Lee, acted with conviction and determination to defend a system that defined their lives, often underestimating the resilience and agency of those they sought to control. Within this tension, ordinary people on both sides were drawn into a conflict that would reshape the country. As neighbors, communities, and families found themselves on opposing sides, caught between allegiance, survival, and conscience. Against this backdrop of ideological, economic, and moral struggle, the experiences of freed Black Americans took on a particularly tragic dimension. They were not merely bystanders in a national conflict. They were active participants whose hopes for freedom, recognition, and security were entwined with the fortunes of armies and the whims of politicians. Their service in the Union Army, their courage in espionage, and their efforts to secure safe passage for loved ones represented both a claim to citizenship and a profound act of agency. Yet their achievements were constantly undermined by systemic racism, neglect, and the brutal realities that awaited them in places like the Devil's Punch Bowl. The very structure of the Civil War, while heralded for its fight against slavery, was simultaneously shaped by these competing economies and ideologies, producing situations where liberty was promised but rarely guaranteed, where freedom existed in theory even as oppression persisted in practice, and where the struggle for equality was inseparable from the broader national struggle for identity and coherence. Understanding the Devil's Punch Bowl in this context transforms it from a singular site of horror into a lens through which we can see the deep fissures of 19th century America. It reveals how industrial ambition, moral consciousness, and economic innovation in the North collided with entrenched agrarian power, social hierarchy, and the violent defense of human bondage in the South, creating a storm of conflict whose effects reverberated far beyond the battlefield. The camp in Natchez stands as a stark reminder that the consequences of these clashes were not confined to generals and legislators. They fell most heavily on those who had the least power to influence events, who bore the brunt of suffering and injustice while helping to shape the very future they were often denied. The story of the North and South, of competing visions and unyielding convictions, is inseparable from the story of those who endured the Devil's Punch Bowl, whose lives illuminate the human cost of national conflict and the enduring struggle for freedom, dignity, and recognition amidst a world divided by ideology and economy. Amid the sweeping tides of conflict that divided the nation, African American men and women emerged not as passive observers, but as active agents in shaping the course of the Civil War, their courage and ingenuity altering the fate of a country still clinging to a fractured sense of liberty. Approximately 186,000 African American men enlisted in the Union Army, a figure that reflected both the growing recognition of their capabilities and the relentless drive for freedom that pulsed through their communities. A testament to the profound stakes of the struggle, they did not march simply as soldiers. They carried with them the hopes of generations, the weight of family histories marred by bondage, and the burning desire to claim rights long denied. From the humblest foot soldier to officers who commanded respect amidst skepticism and prejudice, these men bore arms with a conviction that every act of bravery was a statement against a system that had sought to deny them agency, and every campaign fought was a step toward redefining the boundaries of citizenship and human dignity. Their service was as varied as it was vital, ranging from traditional combat roles to the covert, perilous work of intelligence and espionage, roles that demanded both cunning and nerve. Figures such as Mary Bowser, who navigated the treacherous corridors of Confederate power as a spy, gathering intelligence from within the enemy's household, exemplified the intersection of ingenuity and courage. Bowser's life as a former slave-turned-operative highlights the multidimensional nature of African American contribution. She wielded knowledge as a weapon, infiltrating spaces where suspicion and danger were constant companions, and turning every observation into a strategic advantage for the Union cause. Similarly, Harriet Tubman, whose name had already become synonymous with liberation through the Underground Railroad, extended her legacy into the theater of war, serving as a scout, nurse, and operative. Her missions behind Confederate lines were fraught with risk, yet she persisted, guiding men and women to freedom, providing vital intelligence, and demonstrating that the fight for liberty was inseparable from acts of courage and sacrifice. These individuals were part of larger units, such as the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, the first black regiment organized in the North, whose bravery at battles like Fort Wagner became emblematic of both skill and resolve under fire. The regiment's story, filled with tales of relentless assault and strategic ingenuity, underscores the commitment of African American soldiers who, even when subject to discrimination, lower pay, and skepticism from white counterparts, held fast to the understanding that their fight was more than military, it was existential. Every volley of musket fire, every maneuver across treacherous terrain, was a statement that freedom was worth the cost of blood, and that the courage of these soldiers would become a cornerstone of historical reckoning. They marched and fought not merely for abstract ideals but for the tangible promise of dignity, for a claim on a nation that had long refused to fully recognize them as citizens deserving of respect, safety, and equality. The lives of these men and women intersected tragically with the story of the Devil's Punch Bowl, where the promise of freedom clashed with the harsh realities of systemic oppression and neglect. Many who enlisted were motivated by the hope of securing liberty, not only for themselves but for their families. Yet they understood that the path to justice was fraught with uncertainty. Camps like Natchez, which imprisoned freed black Americans in conditions worse than those endured on plantations, starkly illustrated the gap between national ideals and lived realities. These soldiers fought on multiple fronts, against the Confederacy, against prejudice within the Union ranks, and against a society that was not yet ready to embrace their full humanity. The valor of African American troops, however, became impossible to ignore, shaping military outcomes and laying the groundwork for future recognition, even if full equality remained distant. Beyond the battlefield, African American men and women engaged in acts that were both practical and symbolic, embedding themselves in the very fabric of Union strategy. Intelligence operations, scouting missions, and logistical support were vital contributions that complemented frontline engagements, creating a network of resistance and resourcefulness that amplified the effectiveness of conventional military campaigns. The stories of individuals who risked their lives to relay critical information, to guide troops through unfamiliar terrain, and to provide medical care and sustenance, highlight a dimension of war often overlooked in grand narratives but central to understanding the human effort that underpinned victory. The actions of Mary Bowser, Harriet Tubman, and countless unnamed operatives demonstrate that courage was not solely measured in battles won or lost, but in the persistent, calculated efforts to undermine oppression from within, often at the highest personal risk. Their participation reshaped perceptions of capability and citizenship, challenging both allies and opponents to reconsider assumptions about race, competence, and loyalty. As African American soldiers demonstrated discipline, bravery, and strategic insight, the myth of inferiority propagated by centuries of systemic oppression began to erode, replaced by a record of tangible achievement and sacrifice. Each life risked, each mission completed, and each battle endured contributed to a growing narrative that would inform post-war struggles for civil rights, highlighting both the resilience of those who fought and the injustices that persisted in peacetime. The intertwining of military service with the fight for recognition illuminates the duality of African American engagement. To fight for a nation that had oppressed them while simultaneously claiming the moral and practical authority to participate in its reconstruction, a feat that required extraordinary endurance, vision, and courage. In remembering the approximately 186,000 African American men who served, alongside the invaluable contributions of spies, nurses, and operatives, we honor not just their military service, but their broader role in redefining freedom itself. Their stories, set against the backdrop of the Devil's Punch Bowl and the wider struggles of the Civil War, underscore that liberation was neither simple nor inevitable, but achieved through deliberate action, immense sacrifice, and unyielding courage. By weaving their narratives into the fabric of history, we gain a deeper understanding of the human dimension of conflict, the interconnectedness of struggle and survival, and the enduring impact of those who refused to be silenced, whose bravery carved a path toward justice that continues to resonate through the generations. The dawn of January 1st, 1863, arrived with a weighty promise that seemed, at least in theory, to alter the course of the nation. The Emancipation Proclamation, a document both celebrated and contested, declared that all enslaved individuals within the Confederate States were henceforth free. Its issuance was a turning point in the Civil War, a symbolic and practical pivot that sought to redefine the moral and strategic dimensions of the conflict. Yet its implications were complex and layered, leaving a mixture of hope, uncertainty, and cautious anticipation among those it directly affected. For African Americans, the proclamation represented both a beacon and a challenge, offering the long-awaited affirmation that their bondage was no longer sanctioned by the highest office in the Union, while simultaneously revealing the limitations of freedom granted through political decree rather than societal transformation. It was a proclamation that encouraged black enlistment in the Union Army, signaling a call to action that connected the struggle for liberation with the broader military campaign. But it stopped short of guaranteeing full rights or protections once the war concluded, leaving the newly freed in a tenuous position between promise and reality. The immediate impact of the proclamation was profound. African Americans, both formerly enslaved and free, were called to take up arms, to step into roles as soldiers, scouts, laborers, and spies, thereby actively shaping the fight for the Union and for their own liberation. Their enlistment was not merely a matter of duty or obligation. It was a deliberate assertion of agency, a declaration that freedom was worth the ultimate sacrifice. Even in a nation that had long denied their humanity, thousands answered the call, marching into a war that had already exacted enormous tolls on bodies, families, and communities, yet marching with a resolve rooted in the hope that their service would secure recognition, safety, and dignity. Each man who donned the uniform of the United States colored troops understood that his presence on the battlefield was a statement against centuries of oppression, a direct challenge to the entrenched systems of slavery and discrimination that had long defined the South and complicated the North's moral position. Yet, even as the proclamation stirred hope and mobilized participation, it carried with it the uncomfortable reality that freedom was provisional. The document, framed as a wartime measure, applied only to territories in active rebellion and did not extend to enslaved people in Union-controlled border states or other regions. leaving large populations in continued bondage and creating a patchwork of liberty that highlighted the unevenness of progress. The limitations of the proclamation underscored the paradox of the moment. African Americans were now formally invited to fight for a cause that promised their emancipation. Yet the societal structures that would allow them to claim full citizenship, protection, and equality remained largely unaltered. This paradox intensified the stakes of participation, as every battle fought by black soldiers became both a fight against the Confederacy and a moral assertion that their lives, labor, and loyalty were deserving of recognition and justice. Within this context, the Devil's Punch Bowl loomed as a stark counterpoint to the promise of the proclamation, a reminder that the path to freedom was neither linear nor guaranteed. While the Union called upon African Americans to enlist, camps like Natchez continued to imprison freed black Americans under conditions of deprivation, forced labor, and neglect, illustrating that political declarations alone could not dismantle deeply ingrained systems of oppression. The contrast between the ideals enshrined in the Emancipation Proclamation and the brutal realities of re-imprisonment, starvation, and disease served as a vivid testament to the challenges of translating freedom from paper into lived experience. The proclamation was both a catalyst and a mirror, reflecting the aspirations of those who sought liberty while exposing the societal reluctance to embrace it fully, and it underscored the necessity for continued vigilance, advocacy, and resilience on the part of African Americans determined to claim the rights promised to them. Despite its limitations, the proclamation galvanized action and reshaped the trajectory of the war, infusing the Union Army with new manpower and determination, and altering the moral and political calculus of both the North and South. Leaders like Abraham Lincoln recognized that the enlistment of African American soldiers could provide the numerical and strategic edge needed to sustain the Union's efforts. Yet this practical consideration was inseparable from the broader ethical imperative of recognizing the humanity and agency of those who had been enslaved. As black men joined the ranks, many bringing with them first-hand knowledge of Southern terrain, labor systems, and the vulnerabilities of Confederate strongholds, the Union Army became more than a force of conventional military power. It became a living testament to the determination of African Americans to assert their freedom, to actively participate in shaping the destiny of the nation, and to claim a voice long denied. The dual nature of the proclamation as both an instrument of military strategy and a moral declaration ensured that the journey toward freedom would remain complex and fraught. While African Americans gained the right to fight and, in practice, to earn wages and respect for their service, full civil and political rights remained contested and incomplete, leaving a legacy of struggle that would extend well beyond the battlefield. Their participation in the Union Army, often in segregated units and under discriminatory conditions, reflected both the courage required to embrace this provisional freedom and the broader societal resistance to fully acknowledging equality. Yet, the very act of enlistment, of risking life and limb in pursuit of a promise not fully realized, became a foundational chapter in the long history of black resilience and determination, linking military service, personal sacrifice, and the broader quest for recognition in a nation grappling with its moral contradictions. By understanding the Emancipation Proclamation in the context of the Devil's Punch Bowl and the broader Civil War, it becomes clear that freedom was neither instantaneous nor universally guaranteed, but rather a process defined by struggle, courage, and the persistent assertion of rights against entrenched systems of oppression. The document's issuance marked the beginning of a transformative period, mobilizing African Americans as agents of change, challenging societal norms, and laying the groundwork for subsequent battles over civil rights, equity, and justice. It is a story of both promise and limitation, of hope intertwined with the harsh realities of a nation unprepared to fully honor its principles. and of the enduring human capacity to claim dignity even in the face of systemic denial. Even after the Emancipation Proclamation declared freedom for enslaved African Americans, and countless black men and women fought valiantly in the Union Army, the promise of liberty proved to be fragile, weighed down by the inertia of centuries of systemic oppression and the deep-seated social structures that refused to yield to moral imperatives alone. Freed black Americans returned from battlefields, from the perilous work of espionage, from serving as scouts, nurses, and laborers, bearing both the physical scars of conflict and the unshakable knowledge that they had fought not only for the Union, but for their own fundamental dignity. Yet the world awaiting them was far from the liberty they had risked their lives to secure. Poverty, often deliberately engineered through exclusionary practices and inequitable resource distribution, quickly became the harsh reality for many, limiting their access to education, property, and meaningful employment. Families that had survived the brutality of slavery and the perils of wartime service found themselves in settlements and communities where opportunities were scarce and the promise of self-sufficiency was continually obstructed by policies and practices designed to maintain a racial hierarchy, revealing the stark contrast between the ideals enshrined in law and the lived experiences of those the law ostensibly protected. The violence that permeated everyday life was relentless, an insidious continuation of the terror once used to enforce enslavement, now repurposed to intimidate, dominate, and remind freed black Americans that their humanity remained contested and their freedom conditional. Lynchings, beatings, and targeted attacks were common, often carried out with impunity, serving both as punishment for defiance and as a grotesque warning to others. Communities that had celebrated the end of legal bondage were forced to reconcile the exhilaration of emancipation with the terror of remaining structurally and socially marginalized, where survival depended not only on hard work but on navigating a landscape riddled with arbitrary and systemic threats. Former slaves who had served in the Union Army, who had demonstrated courage and strategic acumen in the fight to preserve the nation, found their contributions largely unrecognized, their sacrifices minimized or ignored, leaving many to grapple with the bitter truth that the nation's gratitude was conditional, selective, and often absent when it mattered most. Segregation, codified in law and reinforced through social customs, further compounded these struggles, creating spaces where African Americans were physically and symbolically excluded from participation in the civic, economic, and cultural life of the post-war United States. Freedmen's communities, while vibrant and resilient, were often isolated, lacking infrastructure, schools, and access to the basic services needed to foster generational stability and prosperity. Within these segregated enclaves, the memory of wartime heroism coexisted with the grinding reality of disenfranchisement, as the very society they had fought to protect systematically denied them the political power and social respect that should have followed their demonstrated loyalty and sacrifice. The juxtaposition of battlefield valor and post-war marginalization underscored a painful irony. African Americans had proven themselves indispensable to the Union's survival, yet the rewards of citizenship, protection, and opportunity were deferred, often indefinitely, constrained by entrenched attitudes of racial superiority and the unwillingness of local and state authorities to enforce justice. This persistent cycle of economic hardship and social exclusion meant that the path to true freedom was neither direct nor guaranteed. It demanded resilience, ingenuity, and communal support to navigate a world that was often hostile to their very existence. Freed black Americans established schools, churches, and mutual aid societies, cultivating pockets of cultural and intellectual growth that offered hope and practical support despite the surrounding adversity. These institutions became lifelines, fostering education, moral guidance, and a sense of collective identity, all while preparing the next generation to confront the inequities that persisted beyond emancipation. The creation of such networks reflected a profound understanding that freedom was not merely the absence of chains, but the presence of opportunity, and that building sustainable communities required effort, planning, and courage in a society structured to undermine those goals at every turn, even as African American veterans sought to reintegrate into civilian life. Their military achievements offered limited protection against the virulent racism that remained entrenched in southern towns and cities. Jobs were scarce, wages were unequal, and the social standing of black families remained precarious, as white citizens and local governments often prioritized the restoration of antebellum hierarchies over the recognition of new rights and responsibilities. Many former soldiers, who had endured the horrors of camps like the Devil's Punch Bowl and had fought courageously in engagements across the nation, faced a world where their service was insufficient to shield them from discrimination, where the promise of liberty was undermined by structural inequities that perpetuated cycles of vulnerability and dependence. The juxtaposition of military valor and civilian marginalization highlighted a stark and enduring tension between legal emancipation and actualized freedom, a tension that African American communities had to negotiate daily, balancing hope with pragmatism, courage with caution, and the memory of struggle with the unrelenting demands of survival. The resilience demonstrated by freed Black Americans in the aftermath of the Civil War illustrates a profound commitment to self-determination, an unyielding pursuit of dignity and agency, and a willingness to transform adversity into opportunity wherever possible. Despite systemic poverty, violence, and segregation, these communities persisted, creating cultural, economic, and political foundations that would, over time, become central to broader movements for civil rights and social justice. Their stories illuminate the complexity of freedom in a society that granted it in theory but resisted it in practice, revealing the courage, intelligence, and persistence required to claim a status that was legally recognized yet socially contested. Through education, community building, and collective action, African Americans continued to assert their place in a nation that had relied upon their sacrifice, but remained reluctant to fully acknowledge their humanity, demonstrating that liberty, when achieved, is not a static gift but an ongoing process requiring vigilance, courage, and collective resilience. As the Civil War drew on and the hopes for freedom and safety grew increasingly urgent, countless African Americans newly emancipated or escaping the tenuous grasp of Confederate control sought refuge in camps established by Union forces and relief organizations, hoping for a semblance of security in a world still defined by violence, instability, and entrenched racial prejudice. These camps, scattered across contested territories, were intended to provide temporary shelter, sustenance, and basic care for those displaced by the chaos of war. Yet the reality that awaited many was far harsher than the promise implied. A mixture of relief and despair that reflected both the logistical challenges of wartime provision and the deeply ingrained social hierarchies that influenced who received what and how. For Black refugees, the camps offered safety from immediate threats such as marauding soldiers, slave catchers, and local mobs, but this protection came at a cost, as the conditions inside were often unsanitary, overcrowded, and insufficiently supplied, leaving men, women, and children vulnerable to disease, malnutrition, and the psychological toll of displacement. Within the confines of these encampments, stark disparities between the treatment of Black and white refugees became painfully evident. a discrepancy that illuminated the enduring prejudice embedded within even ostensibly protective institutions. While white refugees frequently received adequate food, clean shelters, and medical attention, black families were often relegated to meager rations, poorly constructed shelters, and minimal medical care, their basic human needs unmet despite their proximity to the same relief efforts. The inequities were systemic and deliberate, shaped by attitudes that viewed black lives as less valuable, less deserving of investment, and less worthy of attention, perpetuating a hierarchy that mirrored the antebellum society from which these individuals had just emerged. The psychological weight of such treatment was enormous, as it communicated to the very people who had risked life and liberty in pursuit of freedom that their newly claimed status remained conditional, fragile, and contingent upon the whims of authorities and social norms that had long dehumanized them. For families arriving at the camps, the experience was a complicated blend of relief, disillusionment, and constant vigilance. The simple act of securing a meal could become a negotiation of dignity, with women standing in long lines for flour, cornmeal, or beans while children suffered the effects of inadequate nutrition, and men sought work or roles that could provide some sense of purpose and stability. The lack of equitable treatment meant that black refugees often had to endure far greater hardships than their white counterparts. Their days consumed not only by survival but by navigating the social and bureaucratic obstacles designed to maintain separation. Reinforce subordination, and limit the opportunities for recovery and self-determination. Every ration, every opportunity to find shelter, every small comfort was fraught with negotiation and constant awareness that systemic biases governed the distribution of resources, and that the promise of freedom outside the camp walls did not automatically translate into human treatment within them. Despite these overwhelming obstacles, African Americans demonstrated extraordinary resilience, creativity, and determination in adapting to life within the camps, finding ways to sustain community, maintain family cohesion, and protect the vulnerable. Parents improvised schooling for children, teaching literacy and arithmetic with whatever materials they could gather, while elders shared histories, stories, and strategies for navigating a society that had long sought to deny them knowledge and agency. Communal networks developed organically, providing assistance to the sick, comfort to the grieving, and counsel to those struggling to understand the precariousness of their situation, illustrating that even in conditions of deprivation and inequity, a sense of human dignity and solidarity could flourish. Spiritual life became another pillar of resilience, with prayer, song, and ritual offering both solace and a shared affirmation of hope that a better future might be achievable despite the evident obstacles. These acts of resilience and communal care were not merely symbolic. They were practical strategies for survival, offering structure and meaning in a world that was otherwise unpredictable and hostile. At the same time, the camps served as a microcosm of the broader societal challenges African Americans faced, illustrating the gap between legal freedom and practical equality. The disparities in food, shelter, and treatment reflected not only the logistical limitations of wartime provisioning, but also a deliberate social calculus that treated black lives as expendable, reinforcing a message that emancipation, though legally recognized, was not yet socially realized. This reality forced individuals to develop adaptive strategies, whether through labor, advocacy, or communal negotiation, in order to secure basic necessities, highlighting the ongoing tension between formal declarations of freedom and the lived experience of autonomy. The experience of living under such conditions honed skills of resilience, self-organization, and collective problem-solving, skills that would later become essential in post-war reconstruction. Community building, and the pursuit of civil rights. Moreover, The inequities in the camps underscored the fragility of wartime promises and the importance of vigilance, advocacy, and personal initiative. While the Emancipation Proclamation and the Union's military successes offered symbolic and strategic victories, the daily realities within refugee camps revealed that freedom could not be taken for granted, and that the work of creating equitable conditions ensuring access to food, healthcare, education, and safety was ongoing and demanding. Families and individuals navigated a precarious existence, making decisions that would affect their immediate survival while also shaping their long-term ability to establish roots, accumulate resources, and reclaim a measure of self-determination denied for generations. Through the lens of these camps, the broader story of African American resilience during the Civil War comes into sharp focus. A narrative of courage and determination not only on the battlefield but in the quiet, arduous work of survival and adaptation under conditions of systemic inequity. The daily struggles to secure food, protect loved ones, and maintain a semblance of dignity amidst neglect and disparity exemplify a form of heroism often overlooked in conventional histories, revealing that the journey from bondage to true freedom involved far more than legal decrees. It required perseverance, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to the pursuit of life, liberty, and community, even when every day presented new obstacles to that pursuit. Even amid the chaos of war, the deprivation of camps, and the lingering threats of violence and prejudice, African Americans refused to let the turmoil define their identity or diminish their sense of community, demonstrating a remarkable capacity for resilience and cultural innovation that would shape generations to come. From the moment families arrived at refugee encampments or fled into the uncertain safety of Union-controlled territories, there was an instinctive drive to recreate the networks and bonds that had been severed by centuries of slavery and the upheavals of war. Parents, grandparents, and extended kin sought to reunite family members separated by sales. Forced labor, or military service, understanding that the integrity of the family unit was both a source of emotional support and a practical necessity for survival. Children, once denied consistent education, became central to the vision of a future built on knowledge and self-determination, and elders took up the responsibility of teaching literacy, history, and practical skills, sometimes improvising classrooms beneath trees or in hastily converted shelters, fostering the intellectual and moral foundation necessary for a community to flourish even under adverse circumstances. Music, storytelling, and spiritual practices became essential tools for maintaining morale and reinforcing a collective identity, providing a psychological anchor amid uncertainty and oppression. Songs many adapted from African musical traditions, hymns, and improvised compositions allowed both adults and children to express grief, hope, and defiance, embedding lessons of resilience and courage within rhythm and rhyme. In the quiet of night or the scarce leisure hours of the day, these songs were more than mere entertainment. They were affirmations of life, resistance, and shared humanity, uniting people who had endured unimaginable trauma and reminding them that their cultural heritage and sense of self had survived even when the legal and social systems sought to erase it. Storytelling, too, served as a repository of communal memory, passing down accounts of survival, heroism, and perseverance, ensuring that younger generations understood both the dangers they had escaped and the values that sustained their elders through adversity. These narratives forged a continuity that transcended the temporal and geographic disruptions caused by war, displacement, and enforced labor, helping to create a resilient social fabric that could withstand systemic inequities and daily hardships. Education became a central pillar in the effort to assert autonomy and secure a future in which African Americans could claim full citizenship. dignity, and opportunity. Even when formal schooling was scarce, resourceful teachers and elders developed curricula that balanced practical skills, literacy, and moral instruction, preparing young people to navigate a world that remained hostile and deeply segregated. The act of learning, the acquisition of knowledge, and the fostering of critical thinking were revolutionary in themselves, representing both a rejection of the ideology that had long justified their subjugation and an investment in a future where autonomy and empowerment were possible. Communities organized to pool resources for books, writing materials, and lessons, demonstrating both ingenuity and collective determination, transforming meager supplies and adverse conditions into structured learning environments that nurtured hope and possibility. Cultural practices extended beyond education and storytelling, encompassing social customs, shared rituals, and celebrations that reinforced communal bonds and affirmed identity. Weddings, births, and religious ceremonies became focal points for reinforcing networks of mutual support and resilience, while shared meals, cooperative labor, and collective care for the sick or elderly strengthened the social cohesion necessary for survival. Even simple acts of daily life, from sewing clothes to tending gardens, were imbued with the awareness that these efforts were part of building a sustainable, self-determined existence in a society that often sought to undermine it. Through these practices, African Americans cultivated a sense of agency and dignity that was simultaneously practical and symbolic, providing both material support and spiritual sustenance. The creation of spaces for communal interaction, whether through informal gathering areas in the camps or in newly established settlements, allowed African Americans to negotiate, plan, and advocate collectively for their needs. Leaders emerged from within these communities, organizing educational programs, mediating disputes, and coordinating efforts to secure resources from relief agencies or sympathetic union officials, demonstrating both political acumen and moral courage. These community structures were vital not only for survival, but also for the establishment of long-term foundations that would later support reconstruction efforts, civil rights activism, and the enduring struggle for equality. The cultivation of culture, education, and social networks reflected a profound understanding that freedom extended beyond legal recognition. It required the deliberate construction of social, intellectual, and spiritual infrastructure capable of sustaining a people long denied. Both songs, stories, and cultural rituals also served as subtle forms of resistance and assertion, signaling to the broader society that African Americans were not passive recipients of freedom, but active agents in defining its meaning and scope. Music might encode messages of escape, hope, or defiance. Storytelling might celebrate heroes and martyrs who exemplified courage and resilience. Ceremonies and celebrations might reinforce values of cooperation, dignity, and endurance, embedding lessons that transcended immediate circumstances and cultivated a long-term vision for community flourishing. These practices ensured that, even in the face of structural inequality, violence, and neglect, African Americans maintained a sense of identity, continuity, and purpose, creating a legacy of cultural resilience that would inform both local survival and national movements for justice and equality. Through the interplay of education, communal organization, family reunification, and cultural practice, African Americans demonstrated an extraordinary capacity to transform the hardships of war, displacement, and systemic inequity into opportunities for self-determination, continuity, and resilience. The creation of these communities was a deliberate, courageous, and visionary act, illustrating that freedom was not merely the absence of enslavement, but the presence of opportunity, knowledge, and cultural affirmation in preserving identity, sustaining morale, and building functional social networks. These communities laid the groundwork for future generations to claim their rights, assert their agency, and continue the struggle for equality and dignity. Their efforts serve as a testament to the enduring power of human resilience, creativity, and communal solidarity in the face of adversity. A story that underscores the profound truth that the journey to true freedom encompasses both material survival and the cultivation of the mind, spirit, and collective identity. As we reflect on the harrowing history of the Devil's Punch Bowl and the countless African Americans who suffered within its confines, it becomes painfully clear that the stories of those who endured forced labor, malnutrition, disease, and systemic neglect have often been left out of the pages of mainstream history. Yet, it is precisely by uncovering and acknowledging these hidden atrocities that we can begin to understand the full scope of American history and the profound costs of freedom, deferred and denied. The Devil's Punch Bowl, like many other overlooked sites of suffering, is more than just a historical footnote. It is a testament to the resilience, courage, and humanity of those who, despite unimaginable circumstances, continue to hope, to struggle, and to fight for a future that would honor their dignity. By bringing these narratives to light, we not only honor the memory of those who suffered, but we also ensure that their experiences inform our present, shaping a society that is more aware, empathetic, and committed to justice. The legacy of these hidden atrocities is complex and enduring. For generations, African Americans who survived the Civil War and its aftermath were met with systemic barriers that limited their access to basic rights, education, and economic opportunity. The scars of such oppression were not only physical but deeply psychological, affecting entire communities and influencing social dynamics long after the war ended. By acknowledging the full breadth of these experiences, we create space for meaningful reconciliation, a process that requires both historical honesty and a commitment to addressing the lingering effects of injustice. This means confronting uncomfortable truths about the ways in which freedom was promised but only partially delivered, recognizing the human cost of policies and practices that devalued Black lives, and understanding that the journey toward equality has been, and continues to be, a struggle of extraordinary perseverance and courage. History, when fully told, is not just about dates, battles, or political leaders. It is about people, their suffering, their triumphs, and their enduring spirit. The stories of the Devil's Punch Bowl survivors reveal the extraordinary resilience of those who, despite extreme deprivation and systemic inequities, continued to build communities, educate their children, and maintain cultural practices that preserved identity and hope. These narratives remind us that progress is never automatic, that freedom and equality must be actively pursued, and that the lessons of the past are vital for guiding our present and future decisions. By studying and sharing these histories, we cultivate empathy, understanding, and a deeper awareness of the sacrifices made by those whose voices were too long silenced. Acknowledging the hidden atrocities of the past is also a moral imperative. Justice is not only about legal restitution or political reform. It is about truth-telling, recognition, and the validation of lived experiences. By confronting the full reality of sites like the Devil's Punch Bowl, we challenge the selective narratives that have often sanitized history, creating a more honest, nuanced, and complete picture of the struggles and resilience of African Americans. This acknowledgement is essential for societal healing, allowing communities to process collective trauma, celebrate courage and endurance, and learn from mistakes so that such injustices are not repeated. Moreover, It reinforces the principle that history is not static. It is a living dialogue between the past and present, shaped by which stories are remembered, honored, or ignored. The act of remembrance also carries practical significance. Education about hidden atrocities informs current and future generations, fostering awareness of systemic inequality, the consequences of dehumanization, and the importance of civic engagement in protecting the rights of all people. By integrating these stories into broader historical narratives, we create a richer, more accurate understanding of the United States and its ongoing struggles with race, equity, and justice. In doing, we empower individuals to recognize the structural and cultural forces that shape society, equipping them with the knowledge and perspective necessary to advocate for a fairer and more inclusive future. As we conclude this journey into the history of the Devil's Punch Bowl, it is crucial to carry forward both the memory of those who suffered and the lessons their experiences offer. Their courage in the face of unimaginable adversity, their efforts to preserve family, culture, and community, and their unbroken hope for freedom serve as a beacon for all who seek justice and understanding today. By telling these stories, by acknowledging the full spectrum of historical experiences, and by educating ourselves and others, we contribute to a culture that values truth, resilience, and the pursuit of justice, ensuring that the legacies of the past illuminate the path forward. Thank you so much for watching and joining us in uncovering this important chapter of history. If you found this story enlightening and want to support the channel, please like this video, share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to stay updated on future explorations of hidden histories. Your engagement helps keep these crucial stories alive and ensures that the voices of the past continue to inspire understanding, empathy, and action in the present. From all of us here, we wish you a peaceful night and sweet dreams. May your sleep be restful, and may your thoughts carry forward the lessons of courage, resilience, and hope that history has to offer. Good night.